in, everyone, to our focused capacity building series on working with unaccompanied minors. Today in the audience, we are joined by a number of different colleagues who assist on the entire continuum of care of working with children who have been apprehended, placed in shelter care systems, and then released to different communities across the US, and who may be serviced by different actors, such as our intensive case managers,
She
others
do.
in our affiliate network.
And then she
As,
gonna be parked.
as a reminder, I may
She'll get driven when I go
ask
home though.
folks to mute your line. Um, Thank you so much so that we can hear each other. There will definitely be time to dialogue at some point.
So you
Um,
wanna leave here in a minute?
so if you see me with my superpower
You wanna leave here at 9:30?
mute someone, that's because I'm trying to do that. Um, anyway, let me get
You're
started.
fine. I was making you feel.
So our goal with this series, we have two sessions with our guest speaker and expert colleague to focus on building and enhancing our shared understanding of the who, how, and why unaccompanied children are coming to us in our agency settings, and understand what happens to them both prior that journey, once they're here, and then if they are to be serviced throughout resettlement and integration services, primarily through preferred communities. We want to, throughout this whole series, really impart best practices from a strengths-based, trauma-informed case management approach. So you'll hear from Bernal a lot of specific themes related to that throughout today's and our second session, which is on October 10th. It's my pleasure to introduce Bernal Cruz-Munoz. I've had the pleasure of working with Bernal for a while in our shared community of Portland, Oregon, and also overlapped with him at a different agency in my community where we worked together providing mental health services to those that had experienced forced migration. I see him as an endearing colleague and expert in this space, and we're truly honored to have him here today with us and all of you as well to help us deepen our understanding of best practices in supporting unaccompanied children. So with that, Bernal, I will pass to you, and you just guide me with moving the slides forward, and I'm here to help with that process.
Thank you so much, Sasha. You're very kind with your words. I also want to say that I've known Sasha for many years, and I also have a great deal of respect and admiration for her. She's been very supportive of me from the beginning. In fact, she was my supervisor when I was an intern in grad school. And so that's actually how we met. But since then, we've remained close and we continue to work. And I was just very lucky that I found somebody who has a very similar vision to mine in respect to the work that we do. So that's a little bit of our background. As for today, I want to acknowledge that there are folks from different agencies. There are folks from my own agency endeavors here. Welcome, everybody. Nice to see you. Some of you know me from our ambassadors program. Some of you know me from being the associate director for case management. And some of you used to work under my supervision. So it's really nice to have you here. I know that for those of you who were under my supervision, when you see this, it might be a little repetitive because this is the work you were doing when we worked together, right? And so you're all experts in some of the stuff we're going to be talking about. I invite you to chime in if you think I'm saying something that is different from your understanding or something that you may recall. What we know for sure is that all the work we do around unaccompanied children and all the work we do for ORR is dynamic is the word we use, right? It's ever changing. Sometimes it's very surprising. Sometimes we want to ask why. Sometimes we don't have time to ask why. And so we just do what we need to. And at Endeavors, at least in the reunification program, we often used to say things like, there's a risk of trying to build the airplane as we're flying it. But on some level, we don't really have a choice. And so we'll figure it out. So I just wanted to acknowledge that and want to make sure that folks who are well versed on the material we're going to cover feel free to raise their hands and point out any inconsistencies or anything else you might find. I do want to say, in the interest of transparency, that we have a lot of material to get through. So I'm going to kind of come at you real quick. You don't have to wait to raise your hand if you have questions. That you don't have to wait for the Q&A at the end. If you have a question, put it in the chat. Sasha will alert me, or Megan will alert me. We'll take a little pause and address questions. And other than that, please, if you need to get up and move around, by all means, do that. We won't be stopping for any official or scheduled breaks. So just take good care of yourself and do what you need to do. So today for session 1, September 29th, I'm just going to read some of these bullet points. We're going to define who unaccompanied children are, and we're going to identify some important definitions and differences. We'll talk a little bit about their journey, children's journey, and the risk that involves. We'll talk about how they end up in care. So, we know that they get apprehended, but how the heck do they end up here, right, with us? We'll talk about the experience of reunification and what I've come to call the art of case management, because every case is really different. And I almost imagine like a master sculptor, right? And you may not know exactly where the sculpture is going, but you have your tools and you have mastery of your tools and you will use them accordingly, right? As long as you're comfortable with them. Then we'll do a little bit of a deep dive into best practices and how to mitigate concerns. And then we'll talk about home studies, PRS, and other concerns. And then when we meet again on session 2, which is October 10th, we'll talk about some of the challenges kids have, some special concerns, some narratives that are out there currently for this population. We'll talk about considerations for staff, specifically vicarious trauma and burnout. And then I'll be also able then to share with you all my guidance document, and we'll have a more broad Q&A at that particular point. So thank you, Sasha. We can move on to the next slide here. We work with unaccompanied children, and the definition for unaccompanied children is very specific, right? And this is straight from ORR. It's a child who has no lawful immigration status in the United States, has not attained the age of 18 years of age yet, and is somebody who has entered the country without a parent or a legal guardian, or no parent or legal guardian is in the United States to provide care and physical custody. The last part is a little interesting because even if they have a parent, if they've entered unaccompanied, they're going to go into care and we're going to reunify them with that parent. I don't know of cases or circumstances where anything different has happened. I suppose if somebody's at the border and they can prove that's my child, and they would recategorize that kid as not unaccompanied and possibly release them to that parent, but I don't know of that happening. A couple of interesting things here, and we'll get more into this, but children oftentimes travel to the United States with identified family, right? They may be somebody who is their chosen family. There's somebody who they grew up thinking is their family, or they might be traveling in a lot of cases with, for instance, a grandparent who has been entrusted with the care of that child. But upon entering the country, it is determined. I got muted. It's okay, Sasha. It might be determined that that person is not the parent, and therefore that child is then recategorized as unaccompanied, right? So from a child welfare, right, not the ORR welfare, but just broadly child welfare, under no circumstances would we think it's a good idea to separate a child from, say, their caregiver, who maybe for the past 3 years has been their grandparent, with whom they traveled to the United States together. Who knows what they went through, right? But upon entering the U.S., it's determined that's not your parent. And, legally, that's also not your parent. It's not like your parent went to the government, the local government in El Salvador, and filled out documents to say, I relinquish all my rights as a parent, and I'd like to give those rights to my own parent, the child's grandparent. So we don't always observe, what in just sort of the world of welfare is considered the best practices, right? In this case, in ORR, some children get recategorized and become unaccompanied, even though they were in the company of their caregiver. That's very real and it happens all the time, right? We'll be talking towards the end about HSPRS, and a lot of you know exactly what that means, but it stands for Home Study and Post-Release Services. Some of you are HSPRS workers, some of you do only home study, some of you do only PRS, some of you do level 1, 2, or 3 PRS, and we'll talk about that. Now, the affiliates and the preferred community programs is receiving referrals, not just for unaccompanied children, but also for unaccompanied refugee minors. And those are folks who have fled persecution, violence, abuse, and have entered the United States without a parent or custodian. Currently, youth serving this program represent approximately 50 nationalities. These are refugees. Some of them are folks who have received asylum already. They are folks who are from Cuba or Haiti, certain minors with special immigrant juvenile classifications or status, and other types of visas you can see on the screen there. And for those of you who will constantly hear me say ORR, I just want to clarify that's the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is under the Administration for Children and Families. It's a federal agency created in the passing of the United States Refugee Act of 1980. Okay, those definitions are there for you. If you need to take a screenshot, do it, but I suspect you're probably familiar with most of these. Thank you, Sasha.
All right, so go ahead.
Good, no, go ahead.
All right, so hi everyone. I'm Megan from HIAS, and I am the point person for the UC and URM referrals that HIAS receives. So I'm going to just go over the process of UC referrals or unaccompanied child referrals to PC programming really briefly, which I'm assuming a lot of you are familiar with because you received these referrals. So the child is released from an ORR shelter, and once that happens, ORR then sends HIAS a referral for that client to receive PC services. What HIAS does is takes that referral and sends it along to the assigned affiliate. The affiliate is actually assigned by ORR and not HIAS, so it's already predetermined. We just pass it along. The affiliate then you'll attempt contact with the minor or the sponsor, really whose ever contact information ORR has provided in the referral. And the goal is to schedule an introduction to PC services and then do an intake if deemed necessary. When the meeting takes place, the affiliate will provide that introduction to PC services and then again do an intake if necessary. And based on this, the minor could be interested in PC services, ultimately enrolled, or perhaps the minor does not wish to be enrolled at this time, and then they are not enrolled in PC services. Regardless of this outcome, the affiliate will send back a detailed update to HIAS, and then HIAS will then again pass it on to ORR. Alternatively, if the affiliate is unable to reach the minor and or the sponsor after multiple contact attempts, this is also detailed and then reported back to HIAS and also passed on to ORR. Next slide, please. Thank you. So Bernal previously gave us definitions for unaccompanied children and unaccompanied refugee minors. I'm going to share a little bit more about the differences between these because these are the two types of referrals that HIAS receives. So the previous flowchart is a little more specified to unaccompanied child referrals rather than URM referrals. And I'll go into the differences. So unaccompanied refugee minors, these are minors who are aging out of the URM program and they do not have a sponsor. So basically they're turning 18 soon and they're at risk of a gap in services. For these, ORR will provide a very specific deadline they need an update on these referrals by. And this varies referral to referral. It depends when ORR has been notified about this, when they are turning 18, and there's a lot of different variables that go into determining that. So the amount of time given to the affiliate, it's not the same across the board. The information we receive and the expectations of the affiliate are also a little more individualized. And they're detailed by ORR when we receive those referrals and when we pass them along to affiliates. Similarly, these referrals, they usually require more care coordination with the client's current case manager at the shelter or where they're residing, potentially other service providers, and then as well as with the client themselves. And then to reiterate that we expect multiple contact attempts to be made for these referrals. And for URMs in particular, it's really essential to liaise with their existing case manager and ensure that care coordination. So on the other hand, we have UC referrals, and these are unaccompanied children who have been released from ORR custody to a sponsor. For these, OR requires an update within 2 weeks from the day that they send out the referral. So this timeline is uniform. It's the same for all UC referrals. We have not experienced any instance where the timeline has changed. And then similarly, the guidance and instructions are uniform as well. So we receive the same template and the same instructions for every UC referral. And then again, we want to stress kind of both OR and HIAS, we're expecting contact attempts to be made multiple times. Case managers should not only call, leave voicemails if you can, text, and use WhatsApp if appropriate. Send an email if OR has provided an email address. Really exhaust those avenues when trying to reach out to these referrals. Next slide, please. And then this is a chart from ORR that kind of reiterates some of the details that I just went over and the differences, and then add some additional. So it has UC referrals and URM referrals, as well as ad hoc referrals. To my knowledge, HIAS has not received ad hoc referrals, but you could see UC referrals and URM referrals. This details kind of the timeline differences, what referral format that we usually receive, source of referrals, typical client profile. So UC referrals, they're usually Cuban or Haitian minors under 18. And then URM referrals, these are victims of trafficking who are, again, turning 18. They'll be aging out of URM services. And we anticipate ORR to provide more guidance on these types of referrals, hopefully soon. And if and when that happens, we'll be sure to kind of pass those along to our affiliate network. And I will pass back to Bernal.
Thank you, Megan, very much.
Yvonne, I want to let you know we see your question. We'll come back to it here in a little bit once we're doing some more formal Q&A with everyone. So I'll encourage everyone to add your questions in the chat, and we'll have a plan to read them off for Bernal.
Thank you. That sounds really good. So I think it's probably wise for us to reset here a little bit, right? Megan just talked to us about, when children are referred to preferred community programs for services. A lot of times, it sounds to me anyways, that the case manager may not have a full understanding of, what's been going on with this child. They might have an understanding of the reason this child's been referred, right? But there's a lot of jargon and there's a lot of sort of history behind the case. And my aim today is to give you all a full understanding of, generally speaking, what children go through before they get to you. And so I will talk to you from a place of my profession and the work that I've done in reunification. We'll start with the who, where, and why, right? So we've already defined unaccompanied children, children who enter the United States without their parent. Sometimes they've been separated, or their legal guardian. I know that legal guardian is written in there, but it's been my experience that actually I don't think I've ever encountered somebody who's considered a legal guardian who's not a parent. The closest thing to that would be a step parent, somebody who's married to the biological parent. I don't know of any instance where somebody has been able to successfully say, I've gone to through the proper channels in my country of origin, and I've designated this other person as a legal guardian for my child. I don't know that that's happened to me before. So really, in general terms, if that child is not with their parent, that person is going to be considered an unaccompanied child. Okay. The majority of the children that we see come from the Northern Triangle of Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador. Belize is in there, but we don't really see kids from Belize. So I always like to make that exception because we tend to forget that Belize is in that Northern Triangle, right? But we don't really see children from that other country, Belize. We do see children from Mexico from time to time. In the time that I've been working with Endeavors, we've seen children from Venezuela, from Ecuador, some kids from West Africa. And certainly in the program where I used to work here in Portland, Oregon, we used to see also kids from Bangladesh. We saw a couple of kids from China and other areas of South America. But that seems to be the bulk. I am wondering if anybody here is seeing a particular trend. I'm actually just very curious if you're seeing a particular trend of an uptick of any sort of national representation. Feel free to enter in the chat if you're seeing other countries represented that maybe I haven't mentioned, or if you see a sort of trend developing. So we've talked about who, where, and why. I'm sorry, we actually talked about who, where, and now we're going to talk about why. This is a really interesting topic to me. As you may have seen in my bio, I'm from Guatemala. I traveled to the US when I was 13 years old with my family. And I know that things are really kind of politically a lot different than they were back then. But I kind of hold that the reasons people migrate haven't really changed a whole lot. So in this next activity, if we can go to the next slide, I'm going to invite you all to just sort of share, and consider, what are some of the reasons that you understand kids are migrating to the United States? Either what have you seen in your work? What are the children saying to you? And please be mindful of the second question, right? Like, are the reasons the children give for traveling, are these reasons that are supported by things that you see on the media and maybe other sources of information? So to get us going in a little participation here, folks can take out their phone, and we probably should have announced this at the very beginning, but what you'll do is you'll take your camera from your phone, you'll scan the QR code, you'll click the link, and then you'll be able to enter your answers here about why are children migrating. So I'm going to mute myself while we do that. Wish we had a little Jeopardy music for this. I'll give us about 30 seconds to enter your answers, and we'll see how that goes. Right. So generally, the concerns that people are identifying as that there's unsafe, that is an unsafe environment. Similarly, safety concerns. I see tax forms like 1099 and 532. Just kidding. Those are not tax forms. Gang threats, gangs in country of origin. So some very similar answers there. Better opportunities, better economic and educational opportunities. Very good. Yeah. So these are absolutely reasons that I see all the time in care in the shelter, right, where I work at in Pecos, Texas. I've done sort of my own research, I guess, and it's something that I'm really interested and passionate about. Is sort of like the trends of migrations. For those of you who are interested in those topics, look up things like South to South migration, where we have a trend developing of folks going from Southern Hemisphere to other places in the Southern Hemisphere, i.e. Africa to South America, right? We know some of those children end up in the US in the end, right? But if you are to read and or do a dive in media currently, what you're going to find is not just politically driven, but also just seems to be driven by general popular narrative, is that children are leaving places like Guatemala because of the abject poverty, right? It mostly has to do with poverty. That's the argument that I see, right? And where you see people saying like, well, a certain community is unsafe. Well, the community is unsafe because the resources are so low and it's every person for themselves, right? So even if you look at some of these things, like the argument can be made that ultimately this has to do with abject poverty, all right? While I don't disagree with that, I would also say that, Guatemala happens to be actually a rich country with lots of resources. And in fact, that's why sometimes, at least in our history, there's been interventions by outside entities and other countries that come in to protect their political interests and their own economic development. So if you wanted to look into that, you just look up the United Fruit Company and sort of what happened in Guatemala in the late 50s, where the president was replaced by a group of military men by the United States. I know it sounds like a conspiracy, but it's a historical fact, so you can look into that if you'd like. Ever since then, Guatemala has continued to sort of be exploited, right? And although there are resources in Guatemala, what there hasn't really been is development. And currently in Guatemala, some of the industries that are more lucrative are coffee, which was introduced in Guatemala, right? Another industry is palm oil, which is also not native to Guatemala and doesn't really do much for the folks who are using their land to cultivate palm oil. They're not able to grow the food that they need. They're instead growing palm oil because they have contracts with outside agencies. And other things like sugar and tourism, right? But ultimately, these are industries that are really sort of determined and on some level governed by outside agencies. We're not really looking out for our own folks in Guatemala. We're looking out for outside interests. And one doesn't really have to have an economic degree, a degree in economics, to understand that the demand for cheap labor will continue. It hasn't stopped. It hasn't really ever stopped. And as long as that demand for cheap labor exists, there will be a demand for people to move from one place to another to go meet those needs. As for children, what we know is that organized crime agencies and organizations, I should say, are very much involved, right? And we'll get into that a little bit more when we talk about how children are getting to the United States. But this is a highly lucrative industry for cartels, who are basically taking over the communities and making all the families feel unsafe. I could also make the argument why that ultimately has to do with lack of development, right? But we will get into that too much because it's difficult to do that with it getting all political. So thank you for your participation. The parents want better for them. That's another thing, right? It's like, thank you for putting that on there. I have known lots of people who I introduce myself and say, talk about what I do for work. And they say like, how can those parents send the children to the United States? And that's a really nice segue, because now we're going to talk about the way that kids get to the United States, right? So the journey, as you can see on the slide, I'm just going to read a little bit of that. It's very risky. A lot of it depends on how they come to the United States and who they're traveling with. So you can imagine somebody, a young child who's traveling alone is probably at more risk than somebody who's traveling with, say, an uncle or a group of friends or a group of people that they know. This train is called La Bestia, the Beast. It's a very popular way to travel from Mexico to the United States, and is relatively inexpensive. Other methods include, getting driven. You can go from one car to another. You make different stops. There is a very well-defined trajectory that people take from the southern border between Guatemala and Mexico all the way to the United States. And that route is very well defined. It's considered sort of like the way to get to the United States. Most migrants will tell you, we stopped at this town, we went to this other town, etc. There might be a couple of deviations or different routes, but it's a very well-known route. Those trips that you do via cars are absolutely more expensive than hopping on the train, right? I've also known children, for instance, from Ecuador. They'll take a flight all the way to Tijuana, and when they get to Tijuana, they'll link up with their coyote, or the person who's going to help them cross the border, right? So there's really all different kinds of ways to do this, but by far, I would say that probably most of the kids take this particular route, which is the train, or they have somebody who's going to escort them all the way to the border. The cost of that ranges, in my experience, between $3,000 and $7,000 per child. Now, I've heard stories where people will go in Guatemala and Honduras door to door and say, "Hello, Sasha, how are you kids?" And they'll name them. And Sasha will be like, "How do you know my kids' names?" And they'll say, "How was the soccer game last night?" And then you're like freaking out, like, "How do you know that about my family?" And then they say things to you like, "We're running a special currently where we're sending kids to the US for the price of one." I kid you not. We can send your first child now at the cost of $4,000 or $5,000, and then the next one will probably be a little more expensive, or you can send them both right now for $5,000. The parent may refuse, may say, "I'm not trying to, send my kids to the US. They're fine here." They start pointing out to you all the community violence, how kids have disappeared, horrible things that have happened to other children. They'll say goodbye. They'll come back next week. And they keep coming back until you really feel like you don't have a choice. So what's really interesting is that sometimes parents haven't even considered the possibility of sending their kids to the United States, but they're under so much pressure from organized crime that they eventually make that decision. Now, maybe they're made to feel that ultimately it's a really scary thing to keep their children in their country. But they end up traveling to the United States, not because the parents necessarily had that plan initially, but because the alternative really sort of stinks. So regardless of the method, the potential for traumatization is significant, as well as there is potential for the kids actually getting really hurt. Many stories of children being kidnapped along the way, being assaulted. I've heard stories of kids losing limbs after they fall off the train. And certainly I've heard stories of kids witnessing other kids passing away along the way or encountering bodies along the way. I'm wondering if anybody else has heard of any other mode of transportation that maybe hasn't been discussed. So feel free to put any information that hasn't really been brought up on the chat. And yes, there is that documentary of La Bestia and a few books that really kind of talk about that. Okay, we can go on to the next slide. Thank you. So we talked a little bit about this already. When a family decides to send their children to the United States, right? These families are making very difficult decisions. Like I said, sometimes they are just coerced into making this decision. It hasn't really been something they've formulated, but they're responding to a certain imminent threat that exists in the community, right? For the majority of kids, the plan for them to come to the United States has been evolving, right? So on some level, they're kind of excited to get to the United States. We see the gamut, though. We see kids who are really scared. We see kids who didn't really know what they signed up for. Once they get to the United States, the land of milk and honey represents also a certain level of challenges. We'll talk about all that in the future. But the difficult decisions that families make, oftentimes are I think there are ideas and thoughts and concepts that are really easy for families that have never had to migrate to criticize and judge, right? Like, how can you send your kid to the United States? So in some extreme examples, when we've done an assessment with a child, particularly with young women, I remember one case where a young lady shared with us that her father had taken her to clinic to get a shot that would prevent her from getting pregnant over the next, 2 weeks or something like that. So I don't really know what that was, possibly some sort of hormonal intervention injected. But the implicit concern that the parent had was that if my daughter is going to be assaulted, I'm going to at least make sure that she doesn't get pregnant, right? And so to just formulate that idea in your mind, myself as a parent, it's just sort of like, I can't even comprehend the level of concern and fear that the parent may have to leave their child in the country of origin, right? It must be an extreme fear to say, essentially, I just hope she doesn't get pregnant. I know the worst thing that could happen to her is likely to happen, but at least she will not be pregnant, right? So that's a very sort of terrible way of looking at things and really understanding the risk that these children are exposed to and how parents make those decisions, right? So in the majority of situations, these families will incur some debt. And so they don't often have, the $5,000 per child that it will cost to get your kid transferred from one country to another. But the cartels will make that very easy for you. They'll say, you don't have to pay us today. You can pay us in X amount of time, 3-4 years, 2 or 3 years, whatever the case, right? Or I see you have this gorgeous piece of land south facing on the hills of Guatemala. And, that is a very attractive property and we could really use it. And so sometimes the families will give the rights of their land or offer it as collateral, right? Ultimately, the kids are really involved in these decisions, actually, right? And so, what we try to say to folks is that, the child cannot be responsible for this debt. And we will ask for a signed document that says, I, the parent, or I, the sponsor, or whoever, right? I, as an adult, I'm going to assume total responsibility for this debt. Now we have a document that says that the child's off the hook. But the reality is that these children feel a certain level of obligation to repay. And so they're going to promise you that they're not going to go to work. You're going to educate them that they cannot work until they have permission, right? But the reality is that they're very likely to end up doing something to begin to address the high interest and ever-growing debt that their parents have incurred, right? They will need to make sure that their younger siblings and their parents and their grandparents don't lose the land. In some cases, that has been theirs for, the last 700 years, and they may not even have a deed for it, right? It's just how it goes in Guatemala sometimes. So, of course, we talked about the high likelihood of children encountering traumatizing experiences along the way. And I want to just sort of go back to that topic because I'm trying to build a concept here that there is this sort of like three-legged stool of potentially traumatic events, right? We talked about how children experience abject poverty and possibly community violence in their countries of origins. I would say for the majority of children that we work with, something that could be considered potentially traumatizing has happened to the children. It may be something that happened in their family. It may be something that happened in the community. but they're not well in their community, and that's oftentimes why they're coming. And then there's this potential for traumatizing events along the way, like we discussed during the slide with La Bestia. So now you've got two events, traumatizing experiences in country of origin, traumatizing experiences along the journey, right? And ultimately, something that I just find really interesting, because I travel back to Guatemala, at least once a year. Sometimes it'll be like 2 years, but whenever I go down there, what I love to do is just go into small towns, right? My parents happen to be from the northwest region of Guatemala. There's a lot of these sort of very small towns. And I've been to these towns, and I've been able to talk to people about, where are the children? What has happened to them, right? And in certain regions of Guatemala, this happens more, where there's really just no young people left in these towns, right? And it's pretty sad. You see soccer fields overgrown with weeds, which, if you know anything about the communities we help, all they really want to do is play soccer all day long. So usually you'll see like a barren soccer field, right? There's nothing growing, and there's just dust, right? It's not like it's grass, first of all, but nothing is growing because the kids are out there playing, tearing up the field all the time, right? But in some of these communities, the weeds have overtaken the soccer field, right? It's just like evidently there's hardly anyone playing there. The older folks in the community will say there isn't really anyone here to do the things we need the community to be doing, like grow the corn or burn the fields after harvest and that sort of thing, right? And they're definitely experiencing what I think is ultimately the greatest concern. And maybe that's another presentation another day, maybe more like a panel discussion. But the culture is being lost, right? The culture, the language, the ways of living that we have as a country and as an ethnicity survived beyond the 500 years of conquistas, right? Even before. So it's just really sad that I think these children are coming to the United States and leaving their communities in the conditions that they are for the promise of a new Toyota truck or a job at Wendy's or something like that. And hopefully at some point there will be some more work to be done around retention, right? Because if you're connecting these dots, it's sort of like if we could focus on creating more development in these countries, if we can focus on offering children a more safe environment, if we can address the issues around organized crime, then we might be able to retain some of the treasures on this side of the world, right? So that's what happened to the communities.
Let's have a look.
Okay. So now we can talk a little bit about what happens when the children get. We talked about, some kids take an airplane to Tijuana, or La Bestia goes all the way to bordering towns between the United States and Mexico, right? So now the children are there and they're going to come across. So typically they come across on foot. They have what we call foot guides. The guides will take them across. And once they get to the United States side, the majority of children will turn themselves in. Some children will be apprehended. Some are like a combination, where Border Patrol thinks the children are running, but the children are running towards them, right? So ultimately, the children are not trying to escape. They're trying to get apprehended because they understand, because the coyotes and the folks who have traveled with them along the way have told them, this is how it's going to go. Incidentally, the children are, for the most part, very well aware of what's going to happen. They know what to expect. Word has gotten back to their communities or to the coyotes who then educate the children, here's what you're going to need. Make sure you bring a name of a sponsor. Make sure you bring a phone number. Make sure, you have these documents and so on. Make sure you tell them if somebody took your money. Make sure you tell them if somebody took your documents, right? There's definitely cases where kids are like just completely lost and don't know what's going on. But for the most part, we see that children have some understanding of what's going to happen to them, right? Having said that, even if somebody tells you what's going to happen, it's totally different to live that experience, right? So you end up as a child, right? You come across the border and you end up getting apprehended. At that moment, the entities, the agencies that have apprehended the children usually are Border Patrol or immigration, right? They have 72 hours to ensure that that child is then handed over to another federal agency, which is ORR, right? And that can be really, I think, confusing and sometimes I think alarming to children, right? Because for the 72 hours that they're spending in the custody of Border Patrol or immigration, and sometimes it's less, um, they they are being bussed around. Like you can see this bus here, right? They're given these sort of foil blankets that we've seen on the news a lot as well, right? They're put in an air-conditioned room. Sometimes, besides maybe the bus, it's the only experience kids have had in air conditioning, right? That's not something that is really common in homes in Guatemala or Honduras or places like that. In fact, the cold rooms where the children are held have a name. If you happen to know what they call these, feel free to enter it in the chat, and I'll come back. If nobody knows, then I'll reference it. But I know some of you know. So it's just a very strange experience. The children end up in these holding rooms with other children, and eventually they'll be put in a bus. They're driven through the desert, right? It actually kind of looks like another planet down there. And then you arrive at another facility, and the gate or the door or whatever is locked behind you, right? So the workers in that shelter now are probably very kind people like you and I, people who intend to help. But the children may not yet understand that, right? And so they are fearful, and they are uninformed, and they may be experiencing or recovering from traumatic events. And so when they arrive, they are sort of in that condition, right? Just kind of a little bit lost and unaware of what's happening. And this is the first time we really get to interact with the children, right? So it's at this point that we really begin the process of reunification. Remember that first and foremost, the programs, the unaccompanied children shelters, have the obligation to do everything they can to ensure the timely and safe release of the children. That's really it. That's what drives everything. From day one, they arrive, and we're going to get started in trying to figure out who you should be reunified with. Thank you, Sasha. Let's see. Yeah, I think is this a very similar slide to previous? I'm sorry. Because I think I just said this actually, right? So, once they end up in the facility, then we start the reunification process. One of the first things that we have to do is assess who the sponsor is, right? So typically children, again, will know that I have to be able to tell this person who's asking me questions who I'm going to go live with. And so we break these different sponsors into different types of sponsors into different categories. Notice, please, that category 2 is divided into two. In 2A and 2B, right? But for our purposes, and I'm going to move through this rather quickly, category 1 is a parent or legal guardian. We've already talked about what legal guardian really means, right? Unless that's a step parent who's married to the biological parent, we're not really going to consider hardly anything else. This includes qualifying step parents. I just said that, right? And must have legal joint custody, right? And typically these are the cases that case managers consider to be the easiest and have minimal concerns. Although one should never say that, because we definitely have had category 1 or cat 1, as we call it, cases become a complete nightmare. And, that usually comes if we discover inconsistencies or, concerns with safety or background checks that are not indicative of a safe environment to a child. But generally speaking, that could be a pretty quick transition. I've had case managers, some of them on this call, that have turned around category 1 cases like in 4 days. So when we talked about the length of stay, LOS, 4 is pretty impressive, right? Then there's category 2 and category 2B. So when we talk about category 2A, it's a brother or a sister. It could also be a grandparent. It could also be an aunt, an uncle, a first cousin. This is important, who at some point was considered a primary caregiver. If you have an uncle or cousin who was not a primary caregiver, then that's a category 2B. How do you prove that somebody was a previous caregiver? We just need a narrative. We need somebody to tell us, yep, he used to live with his cousin for so many years after this event. We can corroborate that with another family member or with the child. If the stories match, we present that, and then we can move forward as a category 2A. I don't know that there are really much more benefits anymore to having a category 2A versus a category 2B, but it's important that we at least keep those categories straight, right? So we talked about Cat 2B being a cousin, an uncle who was not a primary caregiver, also relatives through marriage, and half siblings, right? Here's a little side note. In Spanish, somebody who's related to you by marriage is politico, right? That's what it is. It's a tío político. It's an uncle by marriage. But oftentimes we want to translate that literally and we'll say a political uncle. That is not a term that should be used. You should probably not put that in writing, right? You should write uncle by marriage, not political uncle, because that's not really a thing that happens in English. This whole thing about relationship is really interesting, and we can get more into that, especially when it comes to categories threes, right? So category threes are distant relatives. If you have a distant relative, you're going to require proof that you're related. And I think, at least initially, I saw a lot of case managers struggling with this, right? Because the family would give you a story that makes sense. There's no reason why you shouldn't believe the things that they're telling you. It's just that they actually don't have any documentation because the birth certificate burned, or somebody has already passed away. But basically what I'm trying to get at is, if you cannot prove that somebody is a distant relative, you should abandon that prospect and you should move to the next line, which is an unrelated adult sponsor. Now, families will balk and sometimes really sort of resist that process because they want you to believe that that is really our distant relative. It's not whether we believe or not, it's that we can't prove it. And because we can't prove it, we're just going to proceed as if this person is an unrelated sponsor to the child, right? You have to prove that there's a social relationship with the parent or with the minor. So be mindful of that, right? If you're trying to prove that somebody has a social relationship with the parent, what you're effectively saying is that that sponsor may not have a social relationship with the minor. Another way of saying that is, this sponsor does not know this kid. Now, that wasn't always the case. There was a time when ORR would not allow folks to reunify with a sponsor they did not know. At some point, that changed. And, I've never been fully comfortable with that, right? I think that there's a lot of risk involved in reunifying a child with somebody they don't know. They might be very good friends with your dad. They might be good friends with your mom, or maybe they were friends 10 years ago, and we can prove that, right? But that, just gives me a lot of pause. And as you can tell by the bottom right corner square there, these are the categories that give the federal team most concern. They're considered most vulnerable. So there will be a lot of safety planning that will be involved in reunifying a child with a sponsor that they don't know. Okay. And then in the gray category, the most dear category in my heart, these are children who I have a very special place in my heart for. These are category 4 kids. These children have no sponsor. Case managers on this call will tell you that there's no sponsor, not from lack of trying. Case managers will bend over backwards to try and find a sponsor for these kids. We'll bend over backwards trying to figure out if we can make a distant relative or an unrelated individual fit. But ultimately, if a child just really truly does not have a sponsor identified, they become a category 4. These children are often referred, they're always referred to the legal service team, who then will help identify, they will screen children to see if they meet criteria for some sort of legal relief, right? Like maybe at some point they can adjust their status, and there's all kinds of categories that would allow for that to happen, right? So there are some benefits to being a category 4, but it brings also special challenges, because oftentimes case managers have to call country of origin and speak to the parent and say, the person who you had identified doesn't want to sponsor. The person who you identified as a potential sponsor doesn't have a home, or they travel too much for work, or for whatever reason, it's not going to work. So your child will now be considered a category 4, and they may end up in the foster care system, or they may end up in a group home. And culturally speaking, that is very difficult, I think, for parents to accept, right? It's not a very common practice that the government takes over the care of your child and assigns them into a house of adults where you don't even know what their values are, or what sort of experiences they might have or have to face, right? But like I said, these children have a very special place in my heart, and I spent a lot of time working with these children here in Portland, Oregon, and I like to brag about the fact that one of them recently sent me a picture of him flying in an airplane because he's graduated as an aviator. And next to him on his airplane was his girlfriend. And he's like, we're getting married soon. So this is, many years ago is when I met him. It's not like we have a 17-year-old flying airplanes and getting married. But, there's a lot of room for success for these kids, right? Thank you, Sasha. So this is the reunification workflow. Again, case managers are here. If you see that I'm missing anything, please feel free to say something. I know you're probably looking at this and being like, this seems very simple, Bernal. But yes, I've purposefully designed this as a very simple way of seeing sort of like the beginning of the end. So let me walk you through this, okay? So a child is released from, nope, let's see. The child actually enters the ORR shelter. I think that we duplicated slides, so I may have erroneously said released from ORR shelter, but the child enters the ORR shelter, right? That's the first square you see there. Well, actually, the child is apprehended at the border, right? Really is what happens there. That's the first square. That's what that should say. The child is apprehended. If the child is an unaccompanied child, then they will eventually be admitted to an ORR shelter. If the child is not unaccompanied, that means they're with their parent or guardian, so we don't need to do anything, right? So if the child does enter an ORR shelter or care facility, we use the terms interchangeably, right? The case manager will determine if that child has a sponsor. If that child does have a sponsor, we will proceed with the reunification. In some cases, we'll determine if a home study is necessary, but if no home study is necessary, then we can, after we do all our background checks and do all the case management work that is involved, and check for any safety concerns, then we will submit for release. That submission for release ultimately ends up with the federal team, who will then say yes or no, that child can be released. However, if a child needs a home study, it will be important that we identify specifically what type of home study and why. Ultimately, when the home study is conducted, usually it's another agency, but these days Endeavors is doing a lot of them. Hence the HS in HSPRS, that's what home study stands for, right? HSPRS. If the home study is conducted, then there are really two outcomes that are possible, right? Positive outcome and safe release, or negative. Incidentally, there is a third option. It's positive with qualifications, but for our purposes, I'm saying it's still going to be positive if you can mitigate the concerns. If the home study comes back as a negative home study, what we need to do is we need to find a new sponsor. Now, the home study could be positive with qualifications. That means we can mitigate some things, and we can continue to follow the process with the identified sponsor. But if it's just not going to work, then we find ourselves having to figure out, how do we find a new sponsor, or is this kid going to turn into a category 4? Again, if the child does not have a sponsor, then we deem that child a category 4 and will be released or transferred to a long-term facility, and will be provided legal services. In most cases, from Endeavors, we transfer those children to another facility, mostly because the facility I work at is considered an emergency influx facility, right? And so we don't keep children for very long. If a case gets complicated, then we'll transfer them to another facility. As an example, we have a newer shelter in Eagle Lake. And I happen to know that there's a kid there who's been there now for about 4 or 5 months because their case is complicated, but that's what that program is designed for, right? We're going to keep kids there a little longer if that's what they need, okay? I know this is a lot of information, and it doesn't even take into account all of the things that could potentially make the case a little more complicated. But to illustrate that, we have this next slide where you'll be able to discern and identify some of the things that can complicate cases, right? So when you think about case management considerations, ultimately in the center of it all really is the interest and the well-being of the child, right? And so all the care that we put into the child and observing their welfare is sort of the central piece of this, right? But the case manager really kind of has to juggle all of these things, right? There may be challenges with the sponsor. What do I mean by that? Sometimes sponsors are very suspicious. They don't really want to talk to you. They'll hang up on you. Sometimes sponsors will tell you somebody else has already called me and they told me not to talk to you. And oftentimes that's fraud, right? It's actually some other arm of the organized crime that's trying to extort the family for money. They'll literally say things like, we're looking to release your child, as you intended, but we're going to need upfront $2,500 for, meals and flight tickets and that sort of thing. Of course, we never ever charge for this sort of work. So that is an alarm that the family has become victim to fraud. That's unfortunately not entirely uncommon, right? We may have a child with disabilities. We may have a relationship that is questionable, right? We may not really truly understand, and I'm going to dare say sometimes believe that there's really truly a relationship, or that the sponsor has the best interest of this child, right? We might have cases that become very long. If you have a case in care of a child who has been in care for, I don't know, let's say they're a category 2 and they've been in care for 2 weeks, expect questions from the federal government. They're going to ask you and they're going to pressure you, right? Why is this kid still here? What is it that you need? Have you done this? Did you check the address? Did you compare this with that? Did you run the background checks, right? So there's a lot of pressure, especially if the length of stay increases, right? We have to mitigate concerns around debt. Who has incurred the debt? What is the plan? Is it reasonable what they're suggesting? Does they require a safety plan, right? We have children who find out that they're pregnant while they arrive at the facility, right? They didn't know they were pregnant. And of course, we run pregnancy tests for all kids, for all girls. And, sometimes they find out that they're pregnant while they're in care, right? We may have children who are experiencing mental health concerns. We have children who have existing chronic conditions like physical health that they were not made aware about, right? And so this is, this all can complicate things. If you have a kid with a disability, you're going to have to actually request a home study. We'll talk about that in a little bit, right? If you have an age redetermination, we considered any kid who is, I was going to say age up. Age redetermination is somebody who we have reason to believe they're not their stated age. And sometimes that is somebody who is younger than their stated age. And sometimes we have adults in care who are pretending to be children, right? And when we find out that they are, in fact, adults, then, there's a whole protocol that gets observed because we cannot have adults interacting with children while they're in care. So one of the things that the case managers I work with will tell you and attest to is that I'm a stickler for language, right? Language access is really, really important. We have a lot of kids of indigenous background. And I know from experience, and I know a lot of you case managers also know, that indigenous children tend to be very meek and humble. And when you talk to them in Spanish, they'll just say, sí, and they'll agree with you. And if you're asking, do you understand me? And they say, sí, that does not necessarily mean they understand you, right? They just said that. And so we should not make any assumptions. We should be very thoughtful and careful about how we are assessing whether a child is able to understand what we're saying. Even if they can understand, if they can express themselves in Spanish, you really need to be working to ensure that there is access to language, for which there are numerous interpreting and translation services throughout the country. So we do see a lot of that at Endeavors. Okay. Can move on here from this slide to the process of reunification. Okay, thank you very much. Let's see, for reunification, we do initial assessments. Some of the assessments are done by the mental health team, but also some of the assessments are done by the case manager. And in most recent practice, there's been a little bit of a collaboration to ensure that these assessments are being done. These assessments offer you a glimpse into like what's going on with the children. They answer the basic questions. What have you come to the United States for? What are your expectations? Where are you going to live with? Did you experience any trauma along the way, right? So you get a comprehensive picture of the child's needs and strengths and identify any special considerations. So then the sponsor has to fill out an application. They have to cooperate with an assessment that is conducted by the case manager. And depending on the category, we'll do a series of background checks, right? It is usually during this time that we'll also be able to determine if a home study is necessary or not. And we'll get to that in just a bit, right? I'm oversimplifying things here. I know that, right? But once all the concerns have been mitigated, and after about 12, 13, 14 days on average, we may be ready to submit a recommendation for release. So I'm gonna slow down for this one, okay? And I'm just gonna read it. Upon completion of all assessments, obtaining all the necessary documents, and mitigating any safety concerns, the case management team may then submit a request for release. First, to the third-party reviewer or case coordinator. So that is, I'm not so sure that affiliate folks are even aware of who the case coordinator is, but the case coordinator is a third-party independent reviewer. Most of these, in fact, I think all of them, are employed by an agency called General Dynamics Information Technology. And you may want to write that down somewhere, GDIT, because you'll hear that referenced often, right? So if a case manager has doubts about what's going on with the case, or if they should move forward or whatever, they're welcome to staff that case with a case coordinator, who presumably is something who's very well versed in policy and child welfare, and they can offer some guidance based on policy. I know case managers experience frustration because sometimes the case coordinator will just say things like, well, what does the policy say, right? If you have a question, let's make sure that you've already reviewed the policy. So for anybody who's interested, if you ever need to staff a case, the first thing you absolutely need to do is review the policy yourself. The next step should be go to a colleague and say, hey, what do you think of this? The next thing should be you go to your supervisor. The next thing is you go to the assistant director. Then you go to the associate director, which would be me in my case, right? And if you still don't have an answer, then you call GDIT. And if they're not able to give you an answer, then presumably you can staff that case with the federal field specialist, who's the FFS, right? And you should start your conversation by saying, I've staffed this internally and with GDIT. That's why I've come to you, right? Then they can probably be more helpful to you. But you should really exhaust those resources before you go to the FFS. The most recent guidance is that all cases will need a third-party review. So we used to have some exceptions to this, but more recently, the thought is that all cases will need to be reviewed by this third party. If the third-party reviewer agrees with the case manager's recommendation of release, then that is then sent over to the federal field specialist, who will make the last decision. If you use a case manager recommending one thing, but the case coordinator recommends a different thing, that also goes straight to the FFS, who then has to basically figure out who they're going to side with, you or the third-party reviewer, right? In most optimal scenario is that you and the case coordinator agree. However, I will say that it's probably healthy to have disagreements every now and then, so the FFS can get the actual entire picture, okay? Move on to the next slide from here. So ORR will offer a final review. The federal field specialists will make a decision, and the decisions are: this case can be approved for straight release. This case will be approved with post-release services, PRS, right? The case can be denied for release. They'll give you a reason why, right? And 4, what we all sort of hate to see is that the case is remanded. That means, generally speaking, that the case is not ready to be presented, or there are some safety concerns that have not been mitigated or addressed. So that is, sort of consider that a slap on the hand to the case manager, essentially, where the case manager is being told, you didn't do your job correctly, check this and this and this, staff internally, redo, send it back to me when those things have been addressed, right? It's not the scariest thing in the world, but for some reason, case managers really internalize that. And, nobody really wants a case to get remanded. It's sort of like the R word. We don't really want to say it. Once the child is released from care, staff will inform the sponsor that the child has been approved for release, and then arrangements will be made for transportation. At PECOS, we have an outside agency that is in charge of, we contract with an outside agency to do transportation, and so they take care of all the logistics as far as that goes. Currently, there's a push for all kids to have post-release services, and so we'll be talking about this a little bit more next time we meet, and I'll probably elicit the input from some of the PRS workers here, but I understand that currently we are really hoping that all kids will have post-release services. Some of these interventions include just a 30-day phone call, right? But then there's the gamut. There's level 2 and level 3 cases where PRS case managers are providing follow-up services depending on the intensity, depending on the need of the child, right? And some of those children are receiving post-release services because they underwent a home study and they were found to have concerns around trafficking, as an example, right? And this is where things begin to overlap, right? Because if a child is considered a level 3 because they have been identified as a victim of trafficking, that child is also very likely going to be referred to the Preferred Communities program. And at least based on what I understand so far, that child may end up receiving intensive case management from the PC program. And that overlap is not something that I happen to know. I don't know if PRS folks are totally aware of that, because on the one hand, it's really good that these kids are getting comprehensive services. On the other hand, there's a really strong possibility that some of these services are being duplicated. So we'll get into that a little bit more. I'm still doing my own research, by the way, about that to find out if that is in fact what's happening. Okay, thank you. I think that kind of brings us to the end of the reunification process. We keep talking about types of home studies, right? There are several. TVPRA home study. This is trafficking victims home study, right? The child is either concerned, we're either concerned that the child is a victim of trafficking. Mind you, at this point, we don't need to determine if the child was in fact a victim of trafficking. We have a concern. And it's very important that we understand that as case managers, it is not our job to determine if a child has been a victim of trafficking. It is our job to elevate the concern and to let other folks at that office do their assessments, right? TVPRA also applies for any child that is considered to have special needs or a disability. And here we can really get in the weeds, because dyslexia, for example, is a disability, right? But TVPRA reads very carefully that, the disability in question needs to be one that really interferes with the child's functioning. And you'd be very hard pressed to argue that dyslexia is disrupting a child's functioning, right? So there's a lot of room sometimes for discussion. I don't really want to say interpretation, but for discussion with FFSs and other entities about whether or not a child's presentation meets the criteria for a disability or special needs, right? If somebody's been a victim of abuse as defined by ORR, right? If you've done child welfare work elsewhere, you may also identify things like exposure to domestic violence as part of abuse. You may also identify abandonment as part of abuse. But for ORR purposes, those things are not defined, right? And so ORR defines abuse very specifically. And if the abuse that the child has reported or the family has made you aware of meets that criteria, then that child would absolutely qualify to undergo a TVPRA home study, right? And lastly, the sponsor represents a risk to the safety of the minor. And if that's the case, usually what you have is somebody who is a habitual drunk or has had a number of DUIs or has an ongoing court case that, maybe indicates there are concerns around child safety. I think the last category there is probably the one that we see the least, because either those concerns can be mitigated in other ways, or we simply determine if this sponsor presents a risk to the minor, that's probably not a good sponsor for this child, right? There also are mandated home studies. So besides the TVPRA concern, sometimes OR will say we need to do a home study for somebody who's a Category 3 unrelated sponsor. If I'm not mistaken, I need to review this. I apologize. I think this has to do, actually, I wonder if anybody here can help me out with this one, but Category 3 unrelated sponsor, if you only have one child, it used to be the case that you did not need a home study. But I think now, if you're sponsoring a single Category 3 unrelated child, you may need to undergo a home study. What is true is that if the sponsor is concurrently sponsoring 2+ children, right, and at least one child is unrelated to the potential sponsor, then you'll undergo a mandated home study. And if the sponsor is seeking to sponsor one or more children after they've already sponsored 2 or more, regardless of category, that'll be a home study. And similarly, for any sponsor attempting to sponsor a child under the age of 12. Now, at my facility, we don't work with children under the age of 12. If we end up with a 12-year-old, we quickly transfer them to another more specialized program. But those would be the reasons why an OR mandated home study is required. And then there are discretionary home studies. Sometimes a case manager will identify a concern that cannot be mitigated either by TVPRA or mandated home study. It also cannot be mitigated by the usual means of inquiry that the case manager usually engages in to find out more information or to understand how any concern around safety could be mitigated. If there's no other option, then you request a discretionary home study. These are a little difficult, in my opinion, to formulate and to sort of convince the federal field specialist that that it should be approved. In my opinion, before you even submit a discretionary home study request, you should be staffing that case with the FFS so they're aware. You'll have an understanding as to whether they sort of tend to agree with you or not as far as the need to have a home study or not. Okay, we'll move on here. So clearly the children are entering the facility, like we said, prior to entering, they had experienced trauma in home country and trauma in country, in home country and trauma along the journey, right? The third leg of that usually is the adjustment, right? So adjusting to your new environment can be really traumatizing. And I don't necessarily mean adjusting to the shelter. I mean adjusting to life in the United States, the prospect of what's going to happen to you. Some of you are familiar with the term of a honeymoon. When children are reunified with their families, things are really cool and going well for the first few weeks, but very quickly kids tend to decompensate or sort of not feel as welcome or have more challenges. But in our facility, our intention in terms of mental health is to promote the wellness first and foremost, to really observe the strengths of the child. We really try to promote and recognize in them what they've gone through and what they've survived and how they ended up here. And we really just sort of try to bolster that, right? And at the same time, we try to ensure that the child is emotionally stable. And so that's really the greatest focus is this child going to remain stable while they're here? Is the child currently stable? Are they experiencing any displacement emotionally? And if so, what is that related to, right? So the mental health team will complete their assessments. They will focus on strengths-based approaches and help them adjust to this new environment. And for that, we use different modalities of therapy. Talk therapy, we have horticulture therapy, music, talk therapy, we have animal therapy these days. And so that really helps. If the child really does not represent any risk or ongoing concerns, then that is made clear to the case manager, who then sort of checks that box that there are no concerns with mental health, and they move forward, right? But in cases where there is identified mental health concerns, then we start with some interventions. Typically, these include more one-on-one time and enhanced safety protocols. And in some severe cases, we've had to get kids hospitalized or transferred to facilities that can better meet their needs. There's a lot that goes on with mental health, actually, and the case managers work in tandem with them very, very closely. Can we go to the next slide, please? And so some of the common presentations, right, given the trauma that children have experienced, are things related to adjustment issues. So if anybody walks away with a potential diagnosis from our facility, it more than likely will be an adjustment disorder. We typically go to psychologists outside our agency to get those types of diagnoses, right? We may see issues related to mood, like difficulty sleeping or bouts of crying or, lability, or, sometimes just sort of conduct related in the milieu. But we definitely keep an eye out for anything related to trauma, right? We don't make any assumptions. Well, maybe the one assumption that we make is that the experiences the children have gone through can be or are potentially traumatizing. And so we try to really develop our entire program around a sort of like trauma lens, right? We provide very sort of basic things like a predictable schedule, right? It really goes a long way if kids know what to expect, right? We ensure that their voices are being heard to the extent that we really incorporate them into the decisions that are being made on a day-to-day sort of schedule at the facility. It's not always easy. Case managers need to know what the schedule is for children so they can have their sessions with them, right? But the schedule is often changing, and it often changes based on the needs of the kids. So I think this is an important thing to highlight, right? We prioritize the needs of the children versus the pressure that we have to carry out the cases. We try to balance those things because ultimately we can't take forever to ensure these cases are being submitted on time. Okay, and for the next slide. We really focus on what's considered the multidisciplinary approach. I think these terms are maybe a little bit old. We need new words here, folks. I mean, if you think about multidisciplinary approach is really the only way to do things. If you think of the opposite, we'd be talking about a linear approach, and I don't think anybody could advocate for why a linear approach to working with migrant children is helpful. But what we really tend to focus on here is that, the multidisciplinary approach includes the different disciplines working with the children, everything from milieu management to education, to case management, to mental health, to physical health, to the medical team, right? We come together and we staff cases that need to be staffed, and we make decisions about the outcomes and the ultimate submission of release to the children based on the input that we receive from everyone, right? That could be an occupational therapist, it could be an art therapist, it could be the music therapist. We really try to incorporate everyone's work into a really sort of well-rounded understanding and present that picture to the federal team so they understand the level to which we have assessed the child's needs and how we've been able to mitigate those concerns, right? So a variety of disciplines offers the children more opportunity to participate and be actively involved in their care. And it's certainly, this approach readily lends itself to more traditional ways of interacting. It's an example. You may have somebody who doesn't really speak Spanish, right? They may understand some things. Maybe they are having sadness around the anniversary of the death of one of their grandparents, and they don't want to talk about it. They're just sad. Maybe they heard a song that really reminds them of that, right? So the clinician very astutely identifies that this child has been regressing or, sort of isolative, but the child either cannot really express themselves or doesn't want to. So in comes in the music therapist, right? And I know this from our music therapist because I was just at a conference with her. She shared with me numerous instances where she would just come in, quietly pick up a guitar, start playing certain scales, to sort of help the child soothe. And immediately we see some relief from the anxiety. The music tends to ground the child. The child looks up and smiles. The music therapist recognizes that and changes the tune to maybe something a little more upbeat, or keeps on with the tune that they're carrying, allowing then the child to begin to express themselves in whatever way they feel safe and most appropriate, even if that is just simply crying or saying, I need to talk to somebody. And then we try to find an interpreter to engage in talk therapy with their clinician, right? The multidisciplinary approach is especially helpful in addressing special populations. So we actually have a special population meeting where anybody who has identified a child who has whatever they consider to be a special need is identified, puts on this list, and then we staff each of these cases daily to ensure that everyone, including the milieu, the case manager, mental health, is on the same page and trying to meet the kids' needs, right? That could be anything from learning disabilities to a child finding out they're pregnant or somebody finding out they have a disease that they didn't know they had, right? Certainly anybody with a disability, certainly with cognitive delays or anything like that would be part of the special population. One of the coolest things we do at Endeavors is we hold town meetings. The children are welcome to come to they're encouraged, they're a necessary part, they're an essential part of the town meeting, the town hall meeting, I should say. And they come in and they are able to express themselves. Sometimes they're the voice of the other children, right? And they'll say things like, we're tired of cold burritos. Can somebody get us some hot beans? Can we play more soccer? Can we have music when we play soccer, right? So they really come in and advocate for themselves. And to the extent that we can, we try to accommodate because we really value their investment in their care. And we want them to have a voice for many reasons. One of those is their participation really makes this a more sort of complete approach to this multidisciplinary notion, right? As well as being involved and investment in your care is an excellent way to sort of address trauma, right? Empowering people is a supremely powerful way of supporting folks who may have experienced trauma. So that'll be that for the multidisciplinary approach. Here's a case study, right? And so again, some of you are very well versed in this, and I'm going to encourage folks to participate in the chat to identify any concerns that they may see. So let me read the right side of this first, and then I'll read you. Actually, is there anyone interested in reading the case study? I don't want to hear myself anymore. If you'd like to read the case study, please let me know. But briefly, please describe what the case manager priorities should be in reunification, right? And how you as a case manager intend to formulate this case for release down the line. What concerns need to be mitigated and how will they be addressed? What other information will you need to ensure the safety and the timely release of this minor? Does anybody want to read this while I drink some coffee?
Bernal, I might suggest that we're planting the case study for the audience as something that everyone can read and attune to some of the complexities right now. But then,
okay.
But then in session 2, I think we could come back to it because I want to make sure we have time for Q&A. Just noting we have about 8 minutes remaining. So
Appreciate that.
everyone capture the story of our 16-year-old girl here from Venezuela and the nuance of what she's experiencing. Be thinking about the support that can be provided to her at initial encounter, wherever she is being connected. Be thinking about the release plan, and then be thinking also about the connection that might occur of her to preferred communities type of programming.
Mhm.
So with that, I think it's a great transition in the time that we have left to introduce Yvonne's question, Bernal, which maybe you didn't see in the chat.
I'm afraid
This one says, I'd like to clarify something that I'm unsure about. And Yvonne, if you're still on the line, feel free to dialogue. Um, she asks, when we're receiving referrals about URM minors, so not unaccompanied, most likely the organization providing services like an ORR shelter to the minor before they're released, connect them to children, youth, and maybe family services, and they're mandated to provide housing and case management. That might include the school enrollment, etc. In these cases, she's saying she's not sure about the role of preferred communities.
Right. Yeah. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that that is generally a confusion everyone has. So, Yvonne, you're not alone in your question. If I'm not misinterpreting your question, what I think you're getting at is, look, if there's somebody already in charge of ensuring this kid has housing and basic needs met, I'm not really sure what our role is. Right. So I'm going to go with that, unless somebody tells me that's not necessarily the way they're interpreting the question or they intended the question to be. I think we're going to have a robust conversation the next time we meet about the challenges that children experience after they're released. I mean, I think that is a whole conversation in and of its own. If we can have a productive conversation about the challenges that kids encounter after they're released, and in some cases they're already adults, right? They're turning 18 or about to turn 18. I think those challenges, for the most part, really have to do with this push-pull of acculturation and assimilation. We'll get into that next week. And they have to do also with adjustment. If you can formulate in your own mind sort of like what those challenges are, I think that can very easily help you determine how you can be supportive. Because then it isn't a question of basic needs. If somebody's already in charge of ensuring that they have housing, a place to live, and that sort of thing, the next thing that would come, in my opinion, I don't think I made this very clear at the beginning, but I'm ultimately a community-based social worker, right? So the next thing that I would formulate is like, what is the path? There's my timer. What is the path to ensure self-sufficiency, right? And how are we measuring that? That would be my next challenge, right? And I would invite the child, the young adult, to participate in that, right? It's, what are some of your goals? I would almost start developing some treatment goals for this child in collaboration, right? And start identifying, well, where are the gaps? Where are the things that you really are motivated to ensure happening for you beyond your basic needs? What is something you're interested in achieving or accomplishing, right? And those may be educational goals. Those may be, a more healthy way to adjust and feel connected to your community. I hope that answers some of your questions. But generally speaking, what I would like to really underscore is that I don't think that there are very clear and specific guidances around what it is that you're supposed to be doing besides and beyond looking for the general wellness of the child, right? Ensuring their welfare.
Bernal,
This is
there was another question. I'm not sure if you can see that one from Sherry
I do see
about
it. Yeah.
the eligibility. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't believe that all children are eligible for PC services. And there are specific criteria that would make them eligible. That is also part of our next conversation. We have a specific slide with the criteria that that they meet. If I'm not mistaken, Sasha, please, or Megan, correct me if I'm wrong. It's like there's 12 categories, and the children have to meet, I think, one of those categories. Some of those categories are, where are the children from, right? Or is there something that renders this child particularly vulnerable, such as having been identified as a victim of trafficking? So if you're a victim of trafficking, it's like a home run. You're going to end up referred to a PC program, right? I'll go back to what I was saying earlier. You would also be receiving post-release services from a level 3 case manager. And is that a duplication of services? Is that beneficial to the child? Do we have two case managers trying to do the same thing? Do we have two case managers doing opposite things? Do we have one case manager having a kid sign a form um, for consent of some sort and have another case manager revoke that consent? I mean, it's just, we really need to find out more about what's happening with these different efforts, right? Yeah, certainly it's time for questions if you have them now.
Yeah,
There's some resources.
Bernal,
Yeah,
on
go ahead.
that point, you're introducing for everyone in this audience who might have a different touch in the lives of unaccompanied children at different points in their journey, whether, pre-release or so sheltered to post-release to other case
Yeah.
management services, that we might be operating in parallel systems, but we may also be having an opportunity to better coordinate what's happening so
Mm-hmm.
that your information that may have been gleaned from some of the caseworkers in shelter care and other environments could be a part of this continuum of support that is then provided to you as the PC case manager, so that you have a
Yeah.
better understanding of the type of, not only the category that somebody's landed
Yeah.
in, the explicit
Yeah.
trauma and experiences that they've had, so that you're formulating your service plan to the best of your ability and perhaps coordinating with some of those post-release service colleagues.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I think you're the ever hopeful, Sasha, and thank you for that. Because there is a wonderful opportunity there, right? I mean, especially if two people are talking to one another and we assume good intentions and everyone's sort of heading in the same direction. I think that can be absolutely useful, right? I'm, on this side of things, often think like, is the right hand talking to the left, or is this one of those things again that has happened, right? I'm not criticizing OR. There's plenty of room for me to criticize OR. I don't have to do it. You guys can do that on your own, But I think that it's really important that we start formulating this in the context of an opportunity, right? And even if services are being duplicated, right? I'm not sure that that's the word we need to be using, right? We can say, we have this person is receiving enhanced services, right? And that could very well be true as long as people are communicating with one another. But in the last minute that we have, I just want to acknowledge that, folks who are working on the preferred communities end of things may not always have an understanding of the nuances that occur in reunification. And they may get jargon written down from an FFS or another stakeholder that says something around, the child was referred to an LSP after they were deemed a category 4 because the TVPRA home study resulted in a negative home study with no qualifications. A person may not know what any of that means, right? And so I sincerely hope that this has been helpful to you in trying to figure out what that actually means. The slides will be all made available to you. I'm always around. Sasha hopefully will send out my email address to you all. If you have questions, you're always welcome to reach out to me. I love this kind of stuff. If it's not obvious, I love geeking out with all of you about this. I'd like to be more of a nerd if I had the time, but I promise to bring some more light to more questions the next time that we meet sometime in October. I think it's October 10th, 11th.
Yes, our next session is October 10th. I'll just mention, when I go to send out both the recording, there were a couple slides at the end that we weren't able to go into depth on, and that they'll be there for you. There's some resources that Bernal wanted everyone to take a look at. There's a really compelling New York Times article, as well as the slide that points everyone to resources from ORR and the guidances that are issued that really kind of help determine the services that we can then provide. This has been very dynamic. There's complicated systems that everyone is navigating. And the goal coming out of this is that we are leaning in on each other's expertise and that we're supporting the safety and well-being of children in their journey, no matter who you are and what agency you're working in and the role that you have. So thank you all. Bernal, feel free also in the chat to add your email if you don't mind. And then also I'll include that in the slides so that people can reach out to you. Bring in your questions into our session 2. And I could try and save some of the questions. there is one about a minor after 18. So if I'm not able to answer that right now, we can come back into that in our second session.
We can. I think the quick answer to that is it depends on whether that child was sponsored or not sponsored. So I'm assuming the question is if a child is not sponsored, they become 18, right? So now they're an adult, right? If they've not received their document, what happens, right? So there's specific budgets for them for housing and household expenses. Depends on what their status is, right? I mean, the worst thing that can happen is that child gets put in ICE custody because they're now an adult and there was no reunification. That happens. We've had kids, for their birthday, they get handcuffed and turned to ICE. That happens. I mean, it's a terrible reality, but it happens. So it's not always a positive and happy outcome. We can save some of the nuance stuff for that answer for next time, if you don't mind. I've entered my email address on there. I've given you my personal address because I'm not representing Endeavors today, but Endeavors is